guys! In this video, we'll be going over Case 4 and Case 6 of the regional case set titled No More Teachers, No More Books, and Dining Out During a Pandemic. Both of these cases revolve around similar issues, including the pandemic and reopening, which is why we chose to group them together in 1 week. So first, let's start with Case 4. In short, Case 4 asks us when schools should reopen, how they should do so, and the different factors that contribute to making this decision. The case itself presents several arguments for both sides. First, we should not reopen schools because there is too much that is unknown about how the coronavirus affects children, and because congregating can allow carriers to spread coronavirus to more vulnerable populations, including older teachers or students and teachers who live with immunocompromised people. On the flip side, we should reopen schools because students need to have formal education, and because certain students who don't have access to resources like the internet will be at a huge disadvantage. Another issue that the case stresses is the recession and financial instability that resulted from the pandemic. These factors essentially force many teachers to continue their employment, even in stressful times, because they can't afford to quit their jobs, and it also puts extra stress on the families of students as well. Finally, keep in mind that cases 4 and 6 are unique because they involve developing situations. Right now, we certainly don't know everything about the coronavirus, so there are a lot of unknowns and uncertainties that we need to consider when we discuss topics like these. With this in mind, let's get started with the discussion questions for Case 4. The first question asks, was it morally permissible to open up schools for face-to-face instruction under the circumstances? Almost immediately, this scenario should hopefully be ringing a bell in your head. We're asking ourselves whether we should be maximizing the lives saved, or if we should find an intermediate balance between saving lives and making sure that people still have a good quality of life during the pandemic. To clarify, what I mean by having a good quality of life during the pandemic is, for example, students being able to have access to quality instruction, or for parents, being able to focus on their job without having the extra burden to take care of their children at home. Essentially, this is a question of whether we should use Bentham or Mill's idea of utilitarianism. Should we go for quantity, or should we maximize both quantity and quality of lives? In this case, it might seem like the intuitive choice is to simply maximize the number of lives saved. After all, this is a pandemic we're dealing with, and a lot of things are unknown about it. Although studies may support the idea that children are at low risk, many of these studies have small sample sizes, which could make them less legitimate. Additionally, there is evidence that children can suffer severe organ damage as a result of the coronavirus, and they can act as asymptomatic carriers. Thus, it seems like it would be best to take precautionary measures and delay reopening as much as possible to prevent unnecessary transmissions and deaths. However, on the flip side, there are a lot of known and guaranteed consequences of delaying school reopenings. For starters, already vulnerable students like BIPOC students, students with special needs, or students who don't have access to proper resources like Wi-Fi or device will not be getting quality education. Additionally, parents won't have time to be full caregivers for the children because many of them will likely be caught up with work or even have to continue leaving the house because of their jobs. So now, we're not just facing a decision between lives and the quality of lives, we also have to evaluate possible consequences against known certain consequences. 3 factors that we can use when evaluating an action under utilitarianism are timeframe, magnitude, and probability. Timeframe is how long it will take the effects to set in. The more distant the effects are, the less important they are, and the more imminent the effects are, the more important they are. So in this scenario, not reopening schools would be best for timeframe, because the negative effects of reopening schools, like those resulting from poor education, will appear in the far future, whereas the negative effects of reopening schools, which includes contracting the coronavirus and even death, will happen in the near future. Next, magnitude is pretty self-explanatory. The greater the magnitude of the consequences, the more important they become. Once again, in Case 4, not reopening schools may result in poor education or extra stress for families, but this has a much lower magnitude than the consequences of reopening schools, which can even include death. Finally, probability judges an impact by how likely it is to happen. Something that is improbable will carry less importance than something that has a high chance of occurring. In this case, contracting COVID-19 is probably a low probability event. Granted, there is a lot that is unknown about it. However, not reopening schools carries the guaranteed impact of poor education, which would be more important on a probability scale. Now, we can take a step back. The drawbacks of reopening schools outweigh those of not reopening schools in terms of magnitude and time frame, but the drawbacks of not reopening schools outweigh those of reopening schools only in probability. Given this information, the better choice would be to not reopen schools yet, because the consequences appear to be worse than those of reopening schools. Now, this is just an example of how you could approach this question. There were a few consequences that I left out from my reasoning, and also many nuances to specific consequences. So when you guys dissect this question on your own, please add your own opinions and thoughts that I left out, and be prepared to share during our next meeting. Some extra things you might want to consider include, are there things schools can do to make reopening schools more morally permissible? Are there things that the federal government can do?
The second question asks, who should be or should have been involved in discussions about the reopening of schools? What principles should be used to make decisions? We all probably know that the decisions are made from different sources, including the district board, the CDC, health experts. But I want to discuss what other additional sources would need to be added in order to provide the safest and most moral outcome. For example, some argue that from not attending school and therefore not actively involved in in-person interaction, children already experience some developmental setbacks. In addition, constantly being in the home environment may cause tremendous stress to those who don't have a stable home environment. Therefore, a child developmental psychiatrist may be needed in the discussion. Some additional sources may be from parents, teachers, and even students themselves in order to make the best decision. Now, take a moment to pause here. Who else could you think of to attend these discussions and make important decisions? The second part of the question asks, what principles should be used to make decisions? As discussed in the previous questions by Grace, time frame could be one of the principles playing a role in your answer. For example, you may argue that we need to control the most current and urgent threats, which is probably to minimize in-person contacts. Or you could look at the long-term and unpredictable outcomes and potentially look at it a different way. The time frame perspective measures how long it takes some effects to settle in. Now, to offer a little bit of my opinion, I place health in front of more long-term setbacks, and I'm interested in hearing yours in our discussion this Thursday. And now, moving forward to question 3, this question says, is there a meaningful difference between the way the decisions to reopen is made by public schools as opposed to private or independent schools? There are many potential arguments you could bring to the table on this question. I personally know that private schools tend to adhere to parents' opinions a little more because ultimately they run on parent support. In addition, turning classes online would mean that the experience for children is compromised in both types of schools, leading to private school parents negotiating for a cheaper price. This may potentially lead to differences between private schools and public schools' decisions, which is the funding they run on. But don't stop your thoughts here. There are differences in regulation by state, by the district board, by guidelines, and much more.
Case 6 is similar to Case 4 in that it discusses the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. However, it focuses on restaurants and dining instead of schools. The case begins by explaining how the United States' response to the COVID-19 pandemic really took a heavy toll on the restaurant and bar industry. In March, many non-essential businesses, including restaurants, were forced to temporarily close to limit coronavirus transmissions. As a result, over 5.9 million people lost their jobs within the next month, and this doesn't even include undocumented employees and those who filed for unemployment after April. Then, beginning in summer, more and more states began allowing restaurants to reopen with outdoor dining and limited indoor dining. The rest of the case focuses on 2 fictional characters, Megan and Andy, who enjoy going out to eat and exploring new restaurants. When restaurants began reopening in summer, Megan and Andy began dining out again, but they were careful to follow all safety regulations. Megan explains that she is comfortable with the risk of getting the coronavirus, but expresses concern about spreading it to others, including the restaurant staff. On the other hand, Andy believes that people need to work, especially given the recent economic recession. Not everyone can qualify for unemployment benefits, so people like restaurant staff members really rely on restaurants reopening to earn an income. For some staff members, being able to work again may come as an economic relief, but for others, it could feel more forced and unsafe. The case ends by questioning the helpfulness of going out and being around strangers. Another question the case implies is about how necessary activities like working to make an income and activities that are just for enjoyment, like going out and dining for the fun of it, weigh differently when it comes to the health and safety of others. With that, let's get into the case questions.
The first question is a typical one. It says, is it ethical to dine in at restaurants in the midst of a pandemic such as COVID-19? All of you already know that by going out, you are putting a considerable amount of risk for you and others to catch the coronavirus. However, going out is not all bad. As the case has stated, the food and more specifically the dining industry, which is quite large and provides jobs to many people, need to continue running in order to generate profit. It is asking for a balance between health consequences and economic consequences. Simply put, choosing one or another, you're causing some harm and doing some benefits. Depending on your situation and belief, you may choose to support one or another. Again, offering some of my opinions, I think the way to maximize beneficial outcomes is to dine out occasionally but stay home more often. When going out, it's also important to remember to follow health guidelines while you support the economy in your own way. The second question of this case says, what responsibility do Andy and Megan have to protect the health of others, especially if those others chose to put themselves at risk? From my perspective, I see a simple solution, and this is to make sure that you follow the health guidelines no matter if the other person chose to put themselves at risk first. I think that no one would wish for themselves to get sick, and oftentimes employees choose to put themselves at risk because of their financial situation. So regardless, I think that Andy and Megan, along others, should consider the impacts they have on others and act accordingly. This includes washing your hands frequently, wearing a mask whenever you can, perhaps making sure that you wear a mask when ordering food, and sanitizing frequently.
Question 3 asks us, how should decisions balancing the support of the economy and the protection of people's health be made during a pandemic? This question is actually fairly similar to the question 1 of case 4. We are asked how much we should support the economy and people's health during a pandemic. Of course, health is important for obvious reasons, but the economy is important for allowing people to maintain their quality of life. If we sacrifice the economy, a lot of people will face financial struggles, which come with a ton of resulting consequences. So once again, this question is essentially asking whether we value the quantity of people's lives or try to maximize both quantity and quality of lives. Similar to case 4 question 1, we can use time frame, magnitude, and probability to evaluate the consequences of solely supporting the economy and solely supporting people's health. Of course, one major distinction between this question and case 4 question 1 is that the balance between supporting the economy and supporting people's health varies along a continuum, whereas there really are only 2 distinct options of reopening and not reopening schools. So when you think about this question, please be careful to consider where you would draw the line between supporting the economy more versus supporting people's health and vice versa. That's the end of our video for cases 4 and 6. Please let us know if you have any questions, and we'll see you guys soon.